Have you scheduled the replanting yet? What month?
We're actually putting together a replanting plan right now. We've selected the plants, and it depends on the watering schedule. So trees will be planted first, and they're going to be planted this spring. We may follow up with shrubs in the fall. Just because of ease of watering, we want to make sure that we can get to the trees to water them, and for survivability rate of the plant material. But we will be planting the trees.
Got questions from council. Council President Bernie.
Thank you for that description of the process that we've gone through. I also wanted you to, can you note the public engagement plan that you put out at the beginning of the year and what that entailed?
Right. So as stated, we did put A-board signs in the park with basically a sign saying that we will be removing trees and a phone number to reach, which was mine. And we also put a message on the city website, on the Idlewood Park web link. And then we also notified the condominium owners to the north of the park because they were the most affected by the trees to the north.
Thank you.
Mr. Carson?
So I had a quick question about complying with all of the regulations that might pertain to this. Could you go into detail a little bit about what you've done?
Right. Yeah, so I communicated with Officer Merrick at the United States Fish and Wildlife Department. They actually have an office right over here in the Willows Industrial Park. So he was familiar with the park, and I talked with him about eagles and eagle nesting. And basically what he said was, if the eagles are nesting in a tree, then you can't touch it. If there are no nests in the tree and it's a hazardous tree, then you can remove it. So I confirmed with Officer Merrick on that. And then I completed a SEPA application, which was approved through the city, and then also a clear and grade permit, which basically allowed us to remove the trees.
Thank you. Mr. Myers? Or excuse me, I had Mr. Fields and Mr. Myers, and then Councilmember Anderson. Okay. Thank you.
So I appreciate the difficulty of all of this, risk versus the benefit of having habitat and all the things that you've considered. When you made that presentation to us, my single and only question to you was, who's going to be not in favor of this? I don't expect you to recall that question, but your answer to me was, we don't know. And I think now we do. And and here's my, I guess it's a question, is what can we do? I know you put out A-boards, I know that you put out notices, but the fact that there are a large number of people here making some pretty good arguments about ideas, what can we do to improve our outreach and make sure that the community understands the decision-making process and also that they're part of that decision-making process?
Right. So I'm sure going forward, you know, it's project specific. I have spent actually quite a bit of time with some of these nice citizens and park patrons in the audience. We've talked on the phone. We've actually walked the site and the property, met in my office and discussed the project at length. And everyone who contacted me by email or by phone, I returned the correspondence. So I'm not sure, I'm not sure, really, in terms of outreach. We could possibly do a press release if we wanted to do that, depending on the project.
The only thing I would add to that is that Idlewood Park is it's not a neighborhood park. It is I can't remember what we call it, but it's a citywide, it's a regional-wide park.
Regional.
Yeah. So so changing something like that impacts people who don't live in the area, and they go there, you know, seasonally. So I guess, I mean, it's too little too late. But just for everyone here listening, my fellow council members, the mayor, I think that we need to really be cognizant of when we need to make extraordinary efforts to reach the community and get their ideas. I see your hand raising, but I'm not presiding the meeting, sorry.
Mr. Myers.
Thank you. First of all, I've got great experience with I have a lot of experience. I can't say it's great experience with cottonwood trees, having 7 of them in my backyard, and had a lot of limb drops. And indeed, the city's tree retention requirements are rather strict, and so every time I went to the city after a limb drop, and I mean a limb that came through the roof and into a room below, and I asked to remove the trees, and I was told they were healthy trees. That happens with healthy trees. And finally, after the 4th one, and my house became uninsurable, I went to the city, and they said, well, let's take a look at some of these issues. And so the question I have for you, Dave, is, and maybe perhaps you can talk a little bit about this, because it is unique to poplars and cottonwoods, but the problem of crowning, which is when you prune or top a tree, that it grows out of that cutting area and creates new limbs that are actually weaker and have weaker joints and create additional problems. Are you familiar with the term?
Yes, actually, you just described it perfectly. Yeah, I mean, basically that's what happens. So your new limbs that come off of a area that was cut are more weakly attached, so they're more prone to actually fail.
And this was one of my concerns when my experience with pruning and topping trees has been singularly unsuccessful, and as a result, finally, the city agreed to allow me to remove these dangerous trees. As I say, when you have 4 limbs actually come through and pierce the bottom, go all the way into the bottom floor, that gets a little bit scary, and when it happens routinely. I still get limbs falling. Fortunately, they haven't been piercing the roof because they haven't been that big. But some of the proposals that have been offered in terms of how we deal with this essentially would exacerbate the problem.
It could, for sure. Yeah, I mean, one of the worst things you can do for a tree is actually top it.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Tuchek. Also, thank you, everybody who's come to speak tonight. I appreciate the opportunity to hear a little bit more about how everybody's feeling. I had a couple questions that I didn't get answered earlier. It was quite a bit close to the meeting, so I apologize for that if you haven't gotten a copy of these, but I had a question regarding the SEPA checklist. If
Right.
this project would be considered categorically excluded?
So it was exempt.
Okay.
So I filled out the application, and then the planner that reviewed it determined it as being exempt.
Okay. And then I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about, you'd mentioned there was a Fish and Wildlife approval.
Right.
What is the process that the city is required to go through? If you might be able to explain that to the folks that are listening, that would be really helpful so we can understand how that approval process
Yeah,
goes.
so actually, there wasn't a formal process to follow, so that we heard and we observed that there were a lot of citizens that were concerned about the eagles, and we have seen eagles in the park. So we wanted to make sure that we were in compliance with the 1940 Bald and Golden Eagle Act. I wasn't familiar with that particular act before this project, but
No, there's no talk from the audience at this point.
so I contacted the United States Fish and Wildlife Department to find out and get clarification in terms of what rules and regulations we needed to be concerned with.
Okay, and then I think the other thing that would be really helpful is that if there's a, since we are a body that looks at policy and budget type decisions, the type of question I actually had was related to your comment that we can't afford to wait for the risk. And so I'm wondering if there's actually a number that we're working with in terms of the cost of the risk versus the $60,000 project that we are going forward with here. So
I would say no. I think Dave's comments about the target are very important here, that this is a high population area. And so while only one person was hit or actually two people were kind of hit last summer. Because of the crowds that gather at this park, the decision is either to block off half or more of the park, but really the assessment is because it's a target-rich area, that's why the risk is so high of a person becoming injured from just one branch falling. Is there anything to add to that, Dave?
Well, I would just say that, yeah, in situations like this, we don't, look at percentages or really dollar amounts or that type of a thing. We just really look at the potential of somebody getting seriously injured, and that's how we assess all of our risks that we see in the parks.
Sure. So I guess my question is related to time then. What's the risk of waiting a little bit longer to get additional public input on this project?
So I think, the timing, the highest risk is during the summer. I've invited literally everybody that has called me and talked to me to give me additional ideas on how we can address this situation. I haven't heard anything that would change my mind at all. There's the solutions are not feasible. They're still risky. Retaining some trees and taking some, the risk is still there. And the bottom line is once we identify that there's a risk like this, we need to act upon it. We can't just leave it.
Any further questions?
And one more comment or question about that. And would this also, if we continue with this project on the current timeline, does it? Are we at risk of a window closing for replanting as well?
No.
We're not.
So we're hoping to have the trees removed over the next 4 weeks, and we can plant the trees pretty much anytime. We're going to be manually watering them during the summer, all through the summer.
Thank you.
Mr. Marchison.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you for all the testimony that we received tonight on this topic. The challenge is, I think this is we were presented and you are facing, and the city is facing, is we have a known hazard from these trees. It manifested itself with a member of our community, or a couple members of our community being injured and some property damage occurring. Thankfully, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, but we now know we have a hazard. Anybody who works in the risk management field knows that then you have been presented with an opportunity to correct something, and there are ways to mitigate risk, and we have examined those ways to mitigate the risk. We did it last year by basically restricting access to what we thought were perhaps some of them were high risk, for lack of a better term, areas. But we knew that going forward, that was probably not the long-term solution that we were going to be able to do. Otherwise, we'd essentially close part of the park off to public access. And this is a very busy park, from not just from the neighbors of the park, but from all members of the community. So the challenge is, how do we mitigate that risk going forward, knowing that we have it out there? And I think, as much as it pains us, and I, too, have had to take cottonwoods down in my backyard, and they are limb droppers. In the middle of nowhere with no wind, just all of a sudden you find a limb dropped in your back. Fortunately, they were far enough away from the house that they damaged toys, not other property. But so I don't envy, again, the situation that we found ourselves in terms of having to make this decision, but I think in terms of what we as a community should value, and that's protecting our residents first and foremost. And I don't want somebody injured for us to come back and say, gosh, if only we would have taken that tree out, but we would not have had an individual injured. And for God's sakes, I wouldn't want it to be a younger person, anybody, honestly. So I realize it's a difficult challenge that we face, and we have to make sometimes some difficult decisions. So I don't necessarily see us going any other direction at this point in time in terms of removing the trees. And you're only removing the ones that are nearest the beach, as I recall.
No, that's correct.
Yeah.
So there are cottonwoods that are going to be remaining in the park, but they're going to be on the south portion of the park, in the natural area, and then also along Idlewood Creek, which has a fence on both sides, and there are cottonwoods that are growing in there, but we don't have any targets in that area.
Any further questions for Mr. Tuchek? Mr. Fields?
So I'm going to just sort of real briefly try to recreate what I thought Councilmember Anderson was asking about risk assessment. What I think I heard you say is you have a risk, you can't calculate it given the unpredictability of cottonwoods, but a lot of trees fall and hit cars and hurt people, and a lot of things happen all the time in our world that we don't expect to happen, but they do. So I guess I'm interested in, how do you quantify the risk reward of the 30 trees? It almost seems anecdotal that you identified a risk and now you need to cut 30 trees in public areas, and that there's no other way to calculate it. And that's not a setup question. I actually believe that's what you're saying, and if that is what you're saying, I just wanted to verify that you can't calculate the risk.
I'm going to cut you off, Mr. Fields,
Sure.
and it's because there's a lawsuit against the city about these trees falling, and we do not want to create further liability with this line of questioning. I think any person being hurt I think the answer was a target-rich area creates liability, and the more targets there are in that area, the higher liability. And going further down this line, our attorney has advised us not to go that route of questioning. If a police officer declared someone dangerous, would we hold a committee meeting about it? No, I think we would act on the professional opinion of our staff, and in this case, our staff is telling us there's a high risk of danger, and of course, no one can be certain about anything. So I'm going to thank you, Mr. Tuchek, for your report, and we're going to move on with the consent agenda at this point.